Hi, my name is Nick Hallenstein, and I want to welcome you to video 3, where we're going to be investigating dynamic values and dynamic schemas. I know that you're so excited about that. It's going to be great. So what are we even talking about? We're talking about the drop-down lists that you see when you go and use one of the out-of-the-box actions. You say, hey, I want to call SQL. It says, great, which table? And it shows you a list of tables. You select a table, and then all of a sudden it knows the shape of every row in the table, and it gives you an input for each of those. And so that functionality, that part of it, giving you the rows, is the dynamic schema. And the dynamic schema can be used for both inputs and outputs. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you some techniques to implement that in your custom APIs that are consumable by Logic Apps and by Flow. So let's take a look. In Visual Studio, I have the same sample project that I've been working with all the way through. In this case, though, I have a separate controller called the DynamicValuesController. And you'll notice that we're going to start off with a simple example. We have this operation where you can vote for your favorite food, and it does everything that needs to be done with any vote. It just says, okay, thank you, and it does nothing with it. It's great. So if we take a look at the country, it is basically a string. That's a parameter that you pass in. It has metadata that says it's the country, and it basically could be anything. I could type anything I want there. I could say that my country is foo. My country is Nickland. That I'm pretty sure that doesn't exist as a country. And so what I really want to provide is a drop-down list of values, including valid countries. In fact, maybe I have a really friendly name I want to show and have a country code in the background that I want to use in my code. So we can implement that using the DynamicValueLookup attribute. Now that's a attribute for either parameters or properties on your models. In this case, this operation, it's just taking it in as an argument. But it might have been on a more complex model where I wanted to point back to some other operation. Now the first part of that is a pointer to another operation, getListOfCountries. Now if we take a look at getListOfCountries, which is way down over here, it does what it purports to do. It gets us a list of countries. And it's going to get us that basically in an object with a countries member, where the countries member has basically an array of objects that have an ID member and a name, where ID is the country code and the name is something we want to show. So there's a display name there. So you could say that the path to the data for the value would be something like, here's my root object, .countries, whatever item, .id. And then we can dot into the name as well. And I might have just got that backwards. But either way, we have the data there, and it's through this operation. Now as I scroll up and I take a look at how we've configured it after giving it the operation, we have to tell it where to find the values. So we're saying the collection of values is in a member called countries in the result of that. So in the result from that operation, it gives us a list of countries, which gives us an ID and a name. And so you'll notice the value path is ID. So that's where we can find the actual value that we want to give back when we call this API. And then finally, the value title. What do we show in the designer for that value? And here it's saying name. It's pointing to where in that object to find that value. So that's all there is to it. It is so simple until it's not. What happens if I have states, I have provinces, and I want to drop those down conditionally based on the country? Well, I guess I can't, right? Well, we actually can, just not with that particular overload. So down here, we have an example where we have a country. We're going to look it up. Same exact dynamic value lookup attribute. That looks great. But then right under it, we have a state. And so this is our getFavoriteFood operation. And getState, notice what we have here. Right after we have the operation, instead of having a value collection, we go straight into the next parameter positionally, which is a list in a nice key value pair form of parameters to pass into, in this case, the getListOfStates operation. And it's saying that the getListOfStates operation has a country parameter itself, and we want to feed that. Notice the curly braces. We want to feed that country. It's bound to the country parameter on this operation. Now, if we didn't have the curly braces, it would assume that we're hard coding that. So the format very much looks like when you're passing into a query string. I tried to write it so it would be key equals value, little ampersand, key equals value, and so on and so forth. If we have curly braces, that says we're binding to another parameter on that same operation. So we're feeding in country that was just passed in to this get list of states. Now, get list of states also does what it purports to. You can see that it's going based on country, and so for a few of those, I've actually gone through, made lists. You can see in the sample code, it's awful. I've actually listed out every single state, and we've built that out, and we're returning that again as an array of objects that have an ID member and a name member, and those names are not mandatory. Those are just what I chose in this case, and as you can see, I've taken those names and I've told that attribute what those are. So I can see ID and name here. All right, so that's looking up dynamic values. That's getting us the drop-down list support. That's awesome. But what about dynamic schema? When I want to detect the shape of an object, or not detect, rather, I want to advertise the shape of an object that I don't know about in advance. Maybe I've never seen it before. I have to go look it up. So what we'll find here is if I go into Visual Studio and I take a look at the DynamicSchemasController, we'll see that there is nothing commented out here. In other words, I'm not adding anything actually in the controller to get us dynamic schemas. Dynamic schemas we actually implement in TRex through a special base class and then an attribute on the model. And the attribute on the model says, hey, this base class, by the way, is completely dynamic. You can add anything you want to it. It's actually backed by a J token, so you can add any properties, anything you want, really. You can even create one from a dictionary. It could be used dynamically. It could be used in a lot of different ways. But basically, it's going to have that base class. It's going to have an attribute that says, here's where you go to generate the schema. So you'll notice our getContactInfo operation has a contact type property. Now, contact type, you can say, give me a phone or give me an email. This is like looking up from a database. Not really. It's an in-memory database, and it's really gross as far as the implementation, but it can give us two different types of data. And we want to know the shape of that data for later steps. Later steps, we want to be able to see what it was. And so that contact type that we're passing in is used to inform what our response is going to look like. Now, our response actually shows up in this Swagger response attribute as a ContactInfo class. And you'll notice that when I look at the ContactInfo class, it derives from DynamicModelBase. Now, DynamicModelBase basically demands that we have two different constructors there. It's just a little bit of boilerplate. One that allows us to create an instance of the class by passing in an object as the source. Usually that's going to be a dictionary of key value pairs, but it really could be anything. And then the other one is just an empty constructor. Now above that, we have an attribute here, DynamicSchemaLookup, and you'll notice that it points to an operation, again by name, called getSchema, and that's technically by Swagger operation ID. So if you are using the Swagger operation attributes, you should be using those exact IDs. I like to use the name of attribute for any internal stuff that normally shouldn't be showing. And you'll notice that we're using the visibility of internal for the operation where we do get the schema. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and find that here. You'll find it right over here, get schema. It does have metadata around it. It does have the getContactInfo schema as the name of it. Oops, that's the operation ID. Let's do this. Let's make that actually the name of getSchema so that it matches, because it really is really important that the operation name does match the name that we're seeing over here in the DynamicSchemaLookup. All right, now once that matches, you'll notice as well that we have a visibility type of internal, and that's saying don't show it in the designer. All right, now if we look inside of it, what it's doing is it's building up a schema. So it basically starts, went a little bit too far there, starts with us creating a new JSchema with a title where we're just naming it after the type passed in, which could be a phone, could be an email. And then if I scroll down, we'll see that if the type was a phone, we're going to emit all these different properties, and that's really hacky. Usually we're going to iterate through something we know about. We're going to emit that more dynamically. And then we're going to actually build that out and respond with the schema for that operation. All right, so we have an operation that's designed to give us just a schema. This class doesn't have a lot going on in it as far as our dynamic model. The rest of the magic is where we're using that class. So if I take a look at the operation where we're actually getting the information, or I should say the methods where we're actually getting the information, what they're doing is they're creating a new ContactInfo instance. And then they're saying, all right, cool. So we're going to set it to this item that's already in this dictionary, if it's there. And if not, we're going to make one up. And you can see how we make one up. We're just newing up a new object with whatever shape we want. We're saying, yeah, the contact info is now this thing. And then we're returning it. So it's very dynamic. Now, if I had a dictionary pre-built, because I went up and I looked in a database for keys and values, I could load that up and I can do it up the same way. Not a big deal to do that at all. If I wanted to use those dynamically, we can actually see an example of that on another operation I have using that. So here's my get contact info. That's where I was retrieving it. Down below, I can see where I'm creating it. So I have a create new contact, which actually uses that as a parameter. And it's a dynamic schema wherever it's used, because that's an attribute on the model, not on the operation, not on anything else. And so I have two different examples here, one where I'm using it dynamically, one where I'm using it as a JToken. And so I just took the opportunity, since we're already basing it on, is it phone, is it email, is the type, to do that. So when it's phone, we're going through and we're saying, all right, cool, we're going to grab that and we're going to use it as such. You'll notice as we look in the response message here, dynamic contact.country code, we're just dotting into that dynamic, which we can see defined up here with the dynamic keyword. Down below, where we're using the JToken contact, which is a instance of JToken, what we're doing is we're basically treating the contact object that we've retrieved as a JToken, and we're going through and we're reading in through the names of the properties, almost as if it were a dictionary there. So we can say display name is JToken contact display name, and we can just read that out. All right, so either way we want to read it, we can read it. Either way we want to create it, if we want to create it through a dictionary, if we want to create it through, treat it as a JToken kind of approach, if we want to, new up a new object with whatever shape and just feed that in as the source, any of those things work. All right, so just to recap the keys there, the big key is the DynamicSchemaLookup attribute. That's critical. It can pass in parameters to the operation just like when we were doing DynamicValueLookup. It binds the parameters of the target operation. In this case, getSchema has a type parameter, and it's binding it to contact type from wherever this gets used, whatever operation this gets used on. It also has a value path. That was important. Where within the object being returned is the schema? All right, so DynamicSchemaLookup was a key. DynamicModelBase was just as important. If we're not using that as the class, it doesn't work. So Swashbuckle rather, is really smart about when it sees dynamic stuff being used, and it says, it's anything, it's just whatever you want. When in this case, we actually want it to be pretty specific, and we want to be able to go back and look up the metadata somewhere specific. So there's that dynamic model base comes with a lot of magic inside, but it's also one of those magic things that we have to do to make this all work. The rest of it is we need to actually write the code to generate the schema. So as you saw earlier there, we had to write the getSchema operation. So attribute, base class, operation to get the schema equals DynamicSchemaSuccess. For DynamicValueLookup, it's the operation to look up the values, and it's the attribute. Once we have all of that in place, we can build some really dynamic APIs. So I'm going to go ahead and publish and see what we have now. So I'm going to go ahead and publish that out there and await the publishing ceremony completion. All right, there it is. There's Edge for us to close. So let's go ahead and close Edge and go over to Chrome. And in Chrome, in the Logic Apps Designer, I'm going to go ahead and add an action. And in this case, I'd like to add a Azure App Services action pointed to our TRex Videos API. So TRex Videos. As I click on that, we'll see that I can vote for my favorite food. I can look up my favorite foods at certain places, and so those are our dynamic values examples. Now, if I do the favorite food lookup, that's the one that has the cascading drop-downs. So I can drop down country, and you'll see it calls that operation to get a list of all the countries out there, and it gives us a really nice display name in the background here. There's United States. And each of those display names is provided in local language as well as English, so that if you're someone that reads either one of those. You'll know what you're looking at. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and select state or province based on what I selected for the country. And so you can see it's loaded a list of those for us. Now, if I would have selected a different country, if I would have said Canada, that was the only other one I implemented as far as list of states, you'll notice it goes out and we find different provinces in this case than we would have seen by selecting the United States. So cascading drop-downs through dynamic values is working great. And then if I add another action here for our dynamic schema, we'll be able to see that on both sides. So I'm going to say Azure App Services, and I'm going to select our TRex videos. And let's go ahead and say I want to go out and insert a contact. So I want to create a contact named Nick, and I'm going to say that I would like to provide my phone. And if I type that, notice what just happened. The card expanded. It went out and it got the schema based on the type of phone, and now it knows that we need a country code, an area code, and a phone number. So I can provide that here. You can call me anytime you want at this number. This is something I will respond to all the time, every day. All right, this is a great phone number. So I'm going to go ahead and add after that another action. So we've seen that it allows me to use the dynamic values on, or the dynamic schema rather, on inputs. But what about outputs? So let's go ahead and add another Azure App Services. And let's say I want my TRex video. All right, I want to go ahead and get contact info. So I've inserted a contact. Now as I look at contact name, notice when I inserted the contact, it gave me the name. There's also some advanced outputs there. I have the actual result message. So I'm going to look up the one I inserted. And for my contact type, I'm going to say I want to look up the phone because it was a phone that I inserted. All right, now that's all I need there. If I look at the response and I click into the body and take a look at the dynamic token picker, notice what it now knows about the response. So remember, the response for getting the contact was that same contact info model, which was looking up a dynamic schema. So now it knows that that's going to be the shape of that object. All right, so hopefully what we learned here is that you can use TRex to make your APIs super dynamic, whether it's drop-down lists through the DynamicValueLookup attribute combined with an operation to actually retrieve that list of values, or whether it's the dynamic schema, where we're going out and we're creating a custom model deriving from the DynamicModelBase and creating an operation to build the schema. In both cases, we can build highly dynamic and really well-polished and easily consumable APIs. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I hope to catch up at some later date, and I hope that you have fun with the TRex. Goodbye.
If you would like to help send me to college, please donate to MarysCollegeFund.eth. Thank you.